Hello and welcome to session 9. This session we're going to carry on from last week, but now we're going to focus on older adults and the needs of nutrients and other aspects during the later stages in life. So let's get started. We're going to explore the different nutrients older adults need and the factors which are actually affecting their food intake, and also how we can overcome some of these major factors. Okay. As we age, people become less active. Their basal metabolic rate reduces. Their overall energy, estimated energy requirements decrease, and then thereby they need to eat less. However, just because they require to eat less does not mean they require less micronutrients. And in many situations, they actually require more. So let's just think about that for a moment. We have a population group which are actually eating less, yet require more. Older adults' ability to absorb and utilize many of these essential nutrients becomes less. Okay, let's look at a number of these factors. First of all, we've got a decrease in gut absorption. This is referring to the body's ability to actually absorb these essential nutrients. You can look at this as in their gastrointestinal tract, as it ages, it's got a less of ability to absorb as much as we did when we were younger. Okay, let's look at digestion. Okay, now to explain this, I want to explain the digestive tract in a bit more depth. So you could think of the gastrointestinal system from mouth to anus as a conveyor belt. Okay, we start with the mouth and we end down at the anus. And as we age, there's less production of hydrochloric acid, so acid within the stomach. There's also less amounts of particular digestive enzymes to break down proteins and carbohydrates. Now, I mentioned before about this conveyor belt. Now, if we have less stomach acid, okay, that will actually signal to our small intestines and our pancreas to release less digestive enzymes, because these enzymes are actually designed to balance out the pH within our gastrointestinal system. So we actually need a lot of hydrochloric acid, so a real acidic environment within our stomach to denature proteins and to actually begin that digestion. Now, during the older or the later years in life, this becomes compromised due to a number of different factors. We can also see that renal function can be impaired, the immune function, bone density. There is this loss of smell as well, and then also a risk of dehydration. Now, this nutrient aspect with aging can be the result of a number of different factors, one of which is chronic diseases. Now, chronic diseases, as you increase, the likelihood of developing a chronic disease increases as well, and thereby in the later years in life you're more likely to have one of these chronic health conditions. The ones that may affect nutrient absorption the most include, yes, particular cancers, but mainly your, let's say, inflammatory bowel disease, such as Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, and also celiac disease, as they directly impact the lining of the gastrointestinal system, thereby affecting the body's ability to absorb these nutrients. The other one, which is worth mentioning, is polypharmacy. So that's the use of multiple medications. So we can actually have drug-nutrient interactions where particular drugs can actually affect both the production, the absorption, the utilization, and also increase the excretion of particular nutrients. So let me give you a few examples. we have a drug called metformin. Now, as you age, the number of individuals on metformin increases. Metformin is used for the management of type 2 diabetes. It's used to regulate blood glucose. However, metformin has been shown to actually deplete vitamin B12 intake, vitamin B12 absorption. So an individual on metformin, they need to ensure that they have adequate B12 levels through pathology testing. Another example of this is prednisone, a particular medication for autoimmune conditions, right? It's used to, let's say, suppress our immune system, so then these auto-antibodies don't come in and start attacking our own cells. However, this particular medication can actually deplete vitamin D in the body. Okay, another medication which a large percentage of the older adults are taking are statins. Now, statins are used to reduce cholesterol and in many cases are essential. However, how statins work, they also deplete something called coenzyme Q10. We haven't discussed this in this lecture, but it's worth mentioning here. It's coenzyme Q10 or CoQ10 is another, let's say, nutrient which the body requires for energy production, especially in relation to the heart. Now, this medication, statin, can actually reduce our body's ability to actually make it. The last one I'll mention is warfarin. Now, warfarin doesn't necessarily affect nutrient absorption or the body's ability to make it. However, how metformin works is metformin is used as to prevent stroke, so to prevent clotting. Okay, and it does so by affecting enzymes to do with vitamin K. Now, individuals taking warfarin will thereby have this imbalance with vitamin K. So it's a very tricky balance, whereas those who are taking warfarin can't actually change the amount of vitamin K that they consume in their diet, or otherwise the medication warfarin won't be as effective. So just a few examples of how chronic disease and also medication can affect nutrient absorption and utilization as we age. Okay, so nutrients at risk in the elderly. There are a number, and we will discuss all of these in depth in the following slides. But to give you an overview, we're thinking of things like protein, omega-3, dietary fiber, vitamin E, vitamin B6, B12, vitamin D, calcium, magnesium, potassium. These are just a few of the macro and micronutrients which let's say, potentially require in larger amounts, or actually required to be consumed in larger amounts because there's a reduced ability of the body to utilize and absorb them in the later years of life. So the nutrient reference values of these will actually increase, whereas your overall estimated energy requirement will actually decrease. So just think about that. We need more nutrients, yet consume less food. So to ensure good dietary intake, we would have seen these before. For the elderly, it's recommended to increase whole grains, fruits and vegetables, fish, nuts and lean protein sources, low dairy products, and decrease, of course, intake of refined grains, simple carbohydrates, and highly processed foods. We need to ensure that the diet is optimal to be able to meet a lot of these macro and micronutrient requirements. So let's start off with macronutrients, and let's drill down into protein. While, let's say, some experts warn that higher protein intake could be harmful due to impaired renal function, recent research suggests that moderately high protein intake is required for maintaining nitrogen balance, supporting with a decrease in protein synthesis, an impaired insulin action seen within older adults. Research has shown that older adults with the highest protein intake lose the least amount of lean muscle mass, something referred to as sarcopenia. A loss of lean muscle mass increases the likelihood of falling. Now, it's been said that maintaining muscle mass in older adults is one of the most important preventative health steps that we can actually take. So protein in itself can actually decrease the risk of malnutrition and falls, decrease muscle loss. Now, the needs and the requirements of protein in older adults is actually increased by about 25% in comparison to younger adults. That's protein. Looking at dietary fiber. Now, by now, we can all appreciate the health benefits of dietary fiber. It's not just important for the young, fit, and healthy, it's even more important for our older adults. Dietary fiber is known to be important for maintaining intestinal health, such as the prevention and treatment of constipation, protecting against heart disease and other metabolic-like conditions. Now, remember, fiber or dietary fiber and also resistant starch is used to produce something called short-chain fatty acid, right? These are short-chain fatty acids within our large intestines, which can help to regulate the pH within our large intestines, the integrity within the large intestines, and also to reduce the risk of particular colon cancers. Now, these dietary fibers, as I mentioned previously, can support against heart disease. It does this through the action within the intestines of binding onto cholesterol. Now, as I mentioned here, metabolic conditions. It does this. Now, remember, when we add fiber, especially dietary fiber, with our meals, it helps to regulate the glycemic index. Okay? Thereby, there'll be less of a peak of our blood sugar, and then there will be less of a insulin response. So thereby can be supportive in older adults with, let's say, type 2 diabetes or other metabolic-like conditions. Omega-3. Okay, now in older adults, omega-3 has a greater protection against many conditions such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cognitive decline. This protection is mostly due to the anti-inflammatory effect found within omega-3. Let's go. More adults don't actually meet the adequate intake of omega-3, and then thereby increasing their risk of inflammatory conditions. I should also mention that there is conflicting research for the use of omega-3 in older adults. It indicates with the greatest results are actually seen over long-term use before the onset of disease. Now, we'd be familiar with this when we spoke about omega-3 in the macronutrient lecture, how there's different types of omega-3. We've got animal-derived omega-3, which has got higher amounts of this EPA and DHA, but then we've also got plant-based omega-3s, such as chia seeds, flax seeds, walnuts, hemp seeds, and so forth. Of note, these plant-based omega-3, only 4% can actually be converted down into your DHA and EPA. Therefore, they're less effective, and although they should be included in the diet, they can't be the main source of omega-3 in older adults. Now, high quality supplementation can be beneficial in older adults. I should note here that not all, let's say, fish oil supplementations are made the same and are as good as each other. A number of, let's say, these relatively cheap fish oil supplements found within, let's say, found within shopping centres and so forth, they are or have a greater risk of being oxidized. Right? Remember how vitamin E is an antioxidant, vitamin C is an antioxidant. Fish oils can become oxidized, become free radicals, right? So some particular fish oil supplements will actually do something called a nitrogen wash within their containers, whereas they wash out all this oxygen, which is a pro-oxidant, out of the container, seal the container, so then the fish oil is more fresh and less, has less antioxidants in it. So that's just a little insight into some so-called good supplementations and some not so good. So nitrogen washing is something to look out for when looking for a omega-3 supplementation for older individuals. Vitamin E may perhaps be the most important nutrient for the prevention of cardiovascular disease. Why? As I alluded to just moments ago, vitamin E is an antioxidant. It's one of the prime antioxidants for our cardiovascular system. All the veins and arteries within our system, this is where vitamin E really comes in to support this balancing act with cholesterol. Now, as we age, there tends to be an increase in blood cholesterol, and then thereby there's this increased need of vitamin E to be an antioxidant to reduce the negative effects of cholesterol within our arteries. So that's vitamin E. Okay, let's talk about vitamin B6. Important for numerous metabolic reactions in the body, with inadequate intake leading to something called homocysteine, so an increased concentration of homocysteine. Now, I want to see if I can draw a little picture here. So we've got something called a methylation cycle here, okay, particular detoxification pathway within our body. Now, as we have learnt, these particular vitamins and minerals will actually help as coenzymes in a variety of different metabolic pathways within our body. So this is very briefly something called the methylation cycle. Now, B6 at this interchange here is important. Without B6, then our body's ability to reduce this homocysteine will actually decrease. So I encourage you to pause the lecture now and just have a little look at homocysteine, something called MTHFR gene mutation, and vitamin B6, and to see that role with older adults. Now, as we can also see that vitamin B6 is important for cognitive function and depression. That is because, as I mentioned before, it is a cofactor, a coenzyme. It supports with particular biochemical pathways. And without B6, then these pathways can't actually occur. And it becomes harder to obtain B6 in the diet in older individuals. Okay, vitamin B12. Now, there can actually be a reduced absorption of B12 in older adults, and that is due to the acidity in the stomach. There's two reasons here. So to actually denature proteins and to get access to a lot of these vitamins and minerals, we require stomach acid to denature these proteins. So that's one element. The other element is something called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is released when we release stomach acid in our small intestines. And this so-called intrinsic factor will come along and bind on to vitamin B12 and then take it down into the small intestines where it gets absorbed. You're unable to absorb B12 without this so-called intrinsic factor. However, there are particular medications that can actually reduce stomach acid, which a large percentage of our older populations are actually consuming. These medications are referred to as proton pump inhibitors, PPIs. Now, these PPIs reduce this intrinsic factor and then thereby reduce the absorption of vitamin B12. Of side note, when talking about these proton pump inhibitors, a research study came out in 2017 where they showed that the use of proton pump inhibitors was associated with a 25% increased risk of premature death. So, layman speaking, taking a proton pump inhibitor was seen to increase the risk in about 1/4 of individuals who took this particular medication. I'll also note here that these proton pump inhibitors were actually designed for short-term use for reflux and not designed for long-term use. Just a little side note there. Moving on. Magnesium and potassium. Of course, goes along with calcium for supporting bone health. Another sidetrack which I thought we can discuss here is estrogen. Okay, estrogen also supports with bone health. Now, estrogen actually helps to maintain calcium within the bones. Think of it as like a blanket over the bones that holds calcium in there. Now, estrogen, being a female sex hormone, will actually decline later on in life. Now, this is due to menopause. Menopause is the cease of menstruation, a menstrual cycle, and then that coincides with a reduction in estrogen levels within the body. And that can result in, let's say, hot flushes and so forth, women going through this menopause. And that is why there is this increased risk in osteoporosis, especially in women after menopause, because of let's say one factor at play here is estrogen. Okay, folate. Yes, folate is important. However, we've spoken about how folic acid is added to our food supply, such as bread, and then thereby can reduce the risk of neurotube defects in pregnant women. Of side note, a high level of folic acid can actually interfere with vitamin B12. It's commonly referred to as the MTHFR gene polymorphism. And that is basically, we're taking a synthetic form of folate. Our body has the inability to utilize it, and then thereby folic acid gets built up within our system. And that can actually increase the risk of a number of different health conditions. So there requires to be this balance between folate and vitamin B12. Vitamin D, of course. Why is vitamin D important? Well, as we have learned that we can get, there's insufficient vitamin D within our diet. Thereby, we require to get vitamin D from the sun. As we age, we have this reduced ability to synthesize vitamin D from the sun. So there's this increased need for vitamin D in the older population. Factors affecting food intake. Maintaining a nutrient-dense diet is critically important for older adults, yet challenging to achieve due to a number of factors affecting food intake, such as physical health, social, economic, and environmental health, psychological health. Now, we're going to discuss these factors in more depth in the following slides. Let's start off with physical health. So older adults, they have a decrease in physical activity, thereby reducing their basal metabolic rate, their estimated energy requirements, and then thereby the need for large portions of food. This can also affect, let's say, their body weight, as they're less physically active, they're burning less kilojoules, and then thereby actually holding on to more fat supplies. There can also be a difficulty in swallowing. If an individual struggles with swallowing due to a medical condition or particular medications, then this may actually reduce their desire to eat foods, potentially all foods or particular foods. Poor eyesight, so eyesight declines with older age, and thereby there's that inability to potentially read labels or even utilize cooking skills within the kitchen, and then thereby a reduced nutrient-rich diet can be seen. Cognitive impairment, thereby, let's say, confusion, forgetting particular ingredients, an inability to cook your own foods. There's also a change in taste and smell, and then the foods in which they prefer may change. And of course, as we alluded to at the beginning of this lecture, multiple medications, this polypharmacy, which can actually suppress appetite and nutrient absorption. All of these factors can affect dietary intake, food intake. Okay, social, economic, and environmental factors. Let's have a little look at these ones now. We've got low income. Of course, if you're living on the pension, you're an older adult, you've got less of a budget to spend on nutritious rich foods, and then thereby that can actually affect your ability to decide on which foods to consume. Inadequate cooking facilities or skills. I know that my grandfather, his only ability to cook is baked beans on toast. Bless his heart, love him to pieces. However, as he's aged, he's got this inability to cook. There's also a lower nutritional knowledge. Thereby, there's this saying, you can't treat old dogs new tricks. And that's somewhat similar with the older generation. Some of my older clients, which I have, to actually convince them and encourage them to change their eating habits is a lot more difficult than those that are young, because they're quite, let's say, set in their way. Another factor which is affecting food intake. And of course, transport. If they don't have means to go to the shops, then they're reliant on other individuals to bring them food. Physiological elements at play for affecting food intake. Sorry, psychological, might I say. You've got loneliness, depression, a loss of an interest in food and cooking. These are all factors at play that can affect an individual's desire to eat. With inadequate nutrition intake, there is an increased risk of disease. Which diseases, you ask? Here we go. A number of chronic diseases, especially things like diabetes. Let's say, well, they're probably not going to be developing gestational diabetes, because that's what happens during pregnancy. The odds of developing type 1 diabetes, I wouldn't say is high, but the odds of developing type 2 diabetes increases with age. Cardiovascular disease as well. We're talking things, okay, yes, hypertension, but then also stroke, heart attacks. These can all affect older adults. Obesity, osteoporosis, dementia, all of these elements are at play when we talk about nutrition and healthy eating for the older individuals. Malnutrition. In older adults, it is common to have malnutrition. Malnutrition can be looked at as an imbalance either a excess or deficiency of energy intake, protein intake, and other micronutrients, which we've previously discussed. Now, all of these imbalances can actually cause a change in, let's say, the shape and size and composition of our body based on these energy and micronutrient intake, which can then go on to affect disease. Malnutrition can include both overnutrition and undernutrition. However, it's most likely the result of undernutrition. We did discuss this in week 1 and week 2. I will also note that we've got a particular condition which is commonly seen in malnutrition in older adults called sarcopenia. Now, this is the progressive and generally loss of skeletal muscles and strength, and there's the increased risk of disability, poor quality of life, and even death in some cases. This is a direct and also indirect response to inadequate nutrient, malnutrition. So let's have a look at this. Contributing factors and health outcomes associated with malnutrition and undernutrition. So particular factors at play here: loneliness, loss of taste, loss of smell, depression. These factors can all, as we've discussed, can go on to result in undernutrition, right? When there's an increased morbidity, okay, there's an impaired immune system, there's what we call sarcopenia, poor wound healing, as I mentioned, delayed recovery. This can then go in to develop undernutrition, but then also undernutrition can increase this increased risk of morbidity. Particular treatments, so a prolonged and frequent hospitalization goes on to increase cost and reduce the quality of life. This can then thereby come back and increase mortality, the rate of death. Okay, looking at these images, which patient would you suspect to be malnourished? Okay, the vast majority of you might say this image. You'll be surprised, potentially both of these individuals may suffer from some form of malnutrition. So the first image is an indication of what we refer to as protein energy malnutrition, or PEM. And it's seen in older people who have excessive weight loss and wasting of the muscles and fat and so forth. The second image is a potential obese individual, and this individual may actually be malnourished in terms of micronutrients and even protein, potentially not overall kilojoule intake. Potentially, we could say that all older adults are at that potential risk of undernutrition, and there's a number of ways we can actually overcome this and address this. So let's look at this further. There are 4 main areas that we'll focus on in regards to the prevention and management of malnutrition in these older individuals. The first is this increased awareness and recognition of the issue at hand. Simply by screening older individuals for their energy intake, their fat mass, and a number of other clinical and anthropometric measurements can be the first step in actually identifying who is at risk. Now, of note is sometimes it requires a number of individuals working together to support an individual with malnutrition. This may include individuals like a dietitian, a nutritionist, a naturopath, a dentist, a pharmacist, the GP, and other professionals must all work together in an integrative manner to support the individual at hand. The second element is the management of medical conditions that may actually contribute to this malnutrition. Okay, so screening for dementia, anxiety, and depression can be beneficial. Reviewing polypharmacy, so what medication is the older individual actually consuming? I see this quite frequently with my own clients where they were prescribed a medication 5-10 years ago, and no one has actually taken the time to review it to go, well, hold on, do you still require to be on this medication? Sometimes, and in many cases they do, but maybe the dose of the medication needs to change. As we spoke about before, these proton pump inhibitors, these PPIs, may affect nutrient absorption and also appetite. So reviewing whether or not they are required, because they may actually make the condition worse. Referred to as iatrogenic. The medications or treatment has actually resulted in the condition in itself. Reviewing the diet. Is there any areas within the diet that can be changed to support this individual become more nutrient balanced? Particular digestive conditions, difficulty swallowing, constipation, nausea, identifying whether they are at play and then treating them accordingly. Frequent visits to the dentist may also be required, and the management of other chronic conditions that are known to affect nutrition. The third element at play is to address social and functional issues at play. Now, this may be the financial aspect of buying these healthier food options. When there's less of an income, then the ability to buy nutrient-rich foods may actually reduce in some cases. Some potential interventions at play here could be Meals on Wheels, getting food delivered to the older individual to ensure that they actually have access to a wider variety of food ingredients. Home visits from yes, family, but other health professionals. So dietitians or nutritionists going to the individual's house and actually performing healthcare at the home may be a way to overcome some of these limitations. Nutrition support. Perhaps, in my opinion, the most important aspect when it comes around to the prevention and management of malnutrition. Nutritional therapies is an important component and should actually be provided alongside the other elements that we have discussed. Actually identifying which macro or micronutrients are deficient in the individual's body is the first step in correcting it, and then from there correcting it, modifying the diet to go, okay, we need to increase more protein, let's increase these particular food items. In some older adults, they've got less of an appetite, and then thereby they may benefit from smaller, more frequent meals. Focusing, yes, on protein. The protein intake is essential because there is that increased need. And let's take a step further to that on how do we support the absorption of protein. So supporting digestive health, supporting stomach acidity to actually break down and utilize these proteins can be a factor at play here. And I will stress, in the vast majority of these older adults, there needs to be this communication and contact with a trained professional, such as a dietitian, a nutritionist, and naturopath, to ensure that all elements are being covered correctly and according to the individual themselves. Okay, this brings us to the end of session 9. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you next time.